So, without further ado, our first speaker is Michael Mandel. Michael is a professor of international law at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto. He's a longtime campaigner for peace and justice and has spoken at numerous anti-war events in Toronto and internationally. Michael is the author of How America Gets Away with Murder, Illegal Wars, Collateral Damage, and Crimes Against Humanity. Please welcome Michael.
Thanks, Nayad, and thanks everybody for coming here. A lot of you, are very well-formed activists, and a lot of this will be familiar to you. So, forgive me if I cover ground that you're already familiar with. Then again, George Bush was last here in 2004 as president, and all this stuff was hashed out at that time. 2004 is already 5 years ago, so many of you might have not been around for the first act of this play. Anyway, let me just talk a little bit about George Bush's war crimes. This is the main point of this meeting. And the list of crimes that George Bush committed while President of the United States for 8 years is truly staggering. The first crime, the one that's not often mentioned, the one, we talk about torture, we talk about Guantanamo Bay, the first crime that's not mentioned is what they call the crime against peace, waging an aggressive war. And that's what the Nuremberg Tribunal, remember in 1946 there was a Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War to judge the Nazis. That's what it called the supreme international crime, a war of aggression. And it differed only from the other war crimes, they said, in that it contained within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. Now, what's the principal evil within the crime of aggressive war? Well, it's like the American prosecutor told the Nuremberg Tribunal. This was Judge Robert Jackson, Supreme Court judge who was the chief prosecutor. He said that an aggressive war, that is an illegal war. An aggressive war just means a war not fought in self-defense and not authorized according to the proper procedures, is just mass murder. That's all it is. It's not only mass murder of the civilian victims, it's mass murder of the combatants as well. Because it's killing deliberately without any lawful excuse. On purpose, deliberately, without any lawful, soldiers and non-combatants alike. Now, the Iraq War has killed, last time I looked, which was about a year ago, I looked at the study of it, it's killed 1,200,000 Iraqis. And of course, it's maimed many more, horribly disfigured many more. There was recently a study that found out that at least, this is a Iraq body count, which minimizes the numbers because it actually studies the cases about which we know, and not, the other study was based on demographics. At least tens of thousands of those killed in Iraq have been children. Little girls and boys like yours and mine. If you think of it, we have this Tory Stafford who was just killed. It's as if somebody serially went on and killed Tory Stafford and then tens of thousands of others, and they kept doing it. That's it's the magnitude of criminality that we're talking about. It's not just a policy choice, it's not just a war crime, it's mass murder. That's what an illegal aggressive war amounts to. What's an aggressive war? As I said, it's a war not undertaken within the strict, obviously, moral and legal limits of self-defense. We all know what that means. It's necessary. There's no other way out. It's the cost is less than the lives saved. Or authorized by the Security Council of the United Nations. All the countries in the world, like the Security Council, we have 5 permanent members with a veto. But if they authorize a war as absolutely necessary in the interests of international peace and security, that's the other ground that makes a war legal. We know the Iraq War lacked both of these reasons. George Bush was able to muster 4 votes out of 15 in the Security Council. And as for self-defense, we know the Iraq War was launched on a bunch of naked lies by sadistic, imperialist, greedy for oil and domination of the Middle East, and with also their own domestic political agenda against their domestic political opponents, not in self-defense, not for peace and security, but for greed and for narrow, petty interests. That was the Iraq War. We know the same thing about the Afghanistan War, by the way. The victims of that war, that was Bush's war, the first one, easily number at least 100,000 people. And those victims are piling up all the time. And it too was launched on lies. Had nothing to do with self-defense against another 9/11. There's a great book by Richard Clarke, who was the security advisor, called Against All Enemies. He was an eyewitness to the discussions that took place on September 11th and September 12th about what to do, what they could do now. And they all knew that the self-defense claim was bogus. It was Rumsfeld who said, he reports, Secretary Rumsfeld noted that international law allowed the use of force only to prevent future attacks and not for retribution. They didn't need to attack Afghanistan to prevent future attacks. Bush nearly bit his head off. No, the president yelled, I don't care what the international lawyers say, we're going to kick some ass, he said. The scumbag. And anyway, but more important than that, this is what Clarke said that he saw the next day. I expected to go back to a round of meetings examining what the next attacks could be, what our vulnerabilities were, what we could do about them in the short term. Instead, I walked into a series of discussions. This is 9/11. This is September 12, 2001, about Iraq. About Iraq. Then I realized with almost a sharp physical pain that Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were going to try to take advantage of this national tragedy to promote their agenda about Iraq. Later in the day, Secretary Rumsfeld complained there were no decent targets for bombing in Afghanistan, and that we should consider bombing Iraq, which he said had better targets. At first I thought he was joking, but he was serious. In other words, the Bush administration wasn't that interested in Afghanistan. It didn't go there for self-defense. It didn't have Security Council authorization. There's a lot of myths about this, but it doesn't. The Security Council resolutions that are supposed to authorize this attack don't even say Afghanistan. They don't mention Afghanistan. The Americans didn't want them to mention it because they wanted to be able to attack everybody. As a matter of fact, General Wesley Clark was shown a memo in November outlining 7 countries that were going to be taken out. This is Wesley Clark. He ran for president of the United States. He was the supreme commander of NATO. He's not, Michael Mandel reporting some memo that doesn't exist. Hit list of 7 countries to be taken out in 5 years, starting with Iraq and finishing off with Iran. Okay, so this wasn't Afghanistan and Iraq were not about self-defense. They were about lies and they were about agendas, greedy, psychopathic, imperialist agendas and domestic agendas. George Bush is about the biggest homicidal maniac of our time. He not only committed mass murder in Iraq and Afghanistan, he committed every other crime on the books, including, of course, torture, not only waterboarding, which is a kind of asphyxiation and mock execution wrapped up into one, but the old-fashioned sexual and physical abuse that we had in Abu Ghraib, stuffing fluorescent lights up the anuses of prisoners. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about. That's the kind of crimes that were committed. And despite this, of course, George Bush is at large in plain sight. He doesn't have a long beard. He's not hiding. He doesn't have a disguise. He's not in a secret hiding place. And that's because the Americans obviously don't put their own presidents in jail, and very few people are tough enough, other than the Americans, to do so. And legally speaking, the Americans have fixed it so that no international tribunal has the jurisdiction to prosecute them. They steered clear of the International Criminal Court, of course, and they have a veto on the Security Council, so they can't have any special tribunals set up. Now, Canada, on the other hand, has laws that cover Bush's crimes. We have the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, and it applies the principle of universal jurisdiction to crimes committed by anyone, anywhere in the world, so long as after they do it, they set foot in Canada. And in a Montreal court today, a Rwandan Hutu was convicted for crimes committed in Rwanda in 1994. And he came to Canada, and we applied this act, and he was tried and he was prosecuted.